Hang about a minute. Has hell just frozen over Mike Harris' skin? Shut up. Well, can I be a pound behind you if you're skinned? In actual fact, I'd be £1 million behind you. I still wouldn't be skinned.
Mark Aizlewood was a Welsh football international, tough, experienced and respected enough to earn 39 caps for his country across a decade of professional football. He played for some of the biggest clubs in England, trained alongside some of the best players in the game and built the kind of career that most footballers only dream about. And then, when it was over, he built something else entirely. I am Oliver and this is Sport Icons. But what if I told you that the reputation he'd spent 20 years earning on a football pitch was the very thing he used to steal millions of pounds from the British taxpayer? That young people who'd never met him had their names signed onto forms they'd never seen, and that when the courts finally caught up with him, he tried to hide behind one of the saddest stories imaginable. This is the story of Mark Aizlewood, the career, the con, the grief he claimed, and what happened after the verdict came in. Mark Aizlewood was born on October 1st, 1959 in Newport, Wales. He came through the youth ranks with Newport County and turned professional in the late 1970s, quickly establishing himself as a tough, technically capable midfielder with the kind of physical presence that made managers take notice. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't the sort of player who filled highlight reels or drew crowds to their feet, but he was reliable, competitive and hard to push off the ball. Exactly the kind of player that wins you matches in the lower reaches of the top flight. His career took him through Luton Town, Charlton Athletic, Leeds United, Bradford City, Bristol City, Cardiff City and Swindon Town, among others. It was a journeyman's path in some respects, but a thoroughly respectable one. He spent the better part of 15 years competing at a professional level in English football, accumulating experience and, more importantly, a name that people in the game recognised and respected. The Wales caps were the pinnacle of it. 39 appearances for his country across the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Not a superstars tally, but enough to mark him out as someone who had genuinely performed at international level. He played alongside players of real quality, competed in major qualifying campaigns, and wore the Welsh shirt with enough regularity to build genuine standing in the game. When he retired, he wasn't leaving as an anonymous journeyman, he was leaving as a former international. That distinction mattered, and as it turned out, someone was paying very close attention to exactly how much it mattered. After hanging up his boots, Aizlewood moved into football coaching and management. He worked at various levels of the Welsh football pyramid, running development programs and working with young players. It was a natural transition, a former professional using his contacts and his reputation to build a second career in the game. Nothing about it raised any flags. Plenty of ex-footballers do exactly the same thing. The problem was what that second career eventually became. Between 2009 and 2011, a company called Lewis Michael Training, known as LMT, was operating in England, presenting itself as a provider of football coaching apprenticeships for young people. The pitch was straightforward. Enroll young people on structured training programs, use government subsidies to fund the courses, and deliver qualified coaches into the game. It was exactly the kind of scheme that funding bodies and colleges were actively looking to support. Football has always had cultural currency in this country, and any program connecting the game to vocational education sounded like a good use of public money. Aizlewood was a director of LMT. His name was on the company. His face was in the meetings. His status as a former Welsh international was, according to the prosecution at his eventual trial, the single most important assets the company possessed. Not because he brought coaching expertise, because he brought credibility. Colleges signed up. Football clubs allowed access. Funding agencies approved applications, and Aizlewood's presence in the room was a significant part of why they did it. The reality of what LMT was actually doing bore no resemblance to what it claimed to be offering. Instead of running legitimate apprenticeship programs, the company was enrolling what investigators would later call ghost learners, students who either didn't exist at all, or who were real people whose names and details were being used without their knowledge or consent. Nobody told these people they'd been enrolled. Nobody trained them. Nobody assessed them. Their names names appeared on paperwork, money flowed from the Sculd's funding agency and from colleges into LMT's accounts, and the training that was supposed to happen simply never did. The falsified paperwork was extensive. Attendance records, assessment forms, progress reports, all of it manufactured, all of it designed to make the fraud look like a functioning educational program. The people running it understood that funding bodies don't show up at every classroom. They rely on documentation. And the documentation, in this case, was fiction. By the time the scheme collapsed and investigators began working through the records, the total amount defrauded from the Skills Funding Agency and from colleges came to approximately £5 million. That's £5 million taken from public funds. Money set aside for the genuine education and development of young people, funneled instead into a fraudulent operation that delivered nothing to anyone except the people running it. Make sure to like and subscribe. And now, back to the video. The ghost learners whose names appeared on the forms never received the qualification, never attended a session, and in many cases had no idea their identities had been used at all. Some of them were young people who had expressed a passing interest in football coaching and had their details captured at some point along the way. Others appeared to have been invented wholesale. The paperwork said they existed. The training said they existed. The money said they existed. None of it was real. When the fraud began to unravel, it unraveled badly. Investigators from the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills started pulling at threads in the LMT operation, and what they found underneath was not a poorly managed company that had cut corners. It was a deliberately constructed fraud, built from the beginning to extract as much public money as possible before anyone noticed. The evidence against Aizlewood and his co-defendants was painstaking in its detail. Investigators mapped the flow of funding applications to the ghost learner registrations, showed how documentation had been fabricated to support false claims, and traced the money as it left government accounts and landed in private ones. The case took years to build. These things always do. Financial fraud at this scale leaves a paper trail, but following it takes time, expertise, and the willingness to spend years in a courtroom making a complex story legible to a jury. Aizlewood was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud by false representation. He denied it. He denied all of it. What Aizlewood told the jury when he took the stand is one of the more uncomfortable parts of this story, because it wasn't entirely invented. There was real grief underneath it, even if the jury concluded that grief wasn't the full explanation. His wife, Penelope, had spent years battling severe depression and substance abuse. It was a long, grinding struggle, the kind that consumes a household, reshapes every relationship within it, and leaves the people closest to it exhausted in ways that are very hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived through it. Aizlewood told the court that during the years the fraud was taking place, he was preoccupied with Penelope's deteriorating condition. He didn't have the time, he said, or the inclination to be managing a complex fraud. He was focused on his wife. He was focused on keeping his family together. Whatever was happening inside LMT, he claimed, he simply wasn't paying close enough attention to see it. That defense had a specific emotional logic to it. If you've watched someone you love spiral downward through mental illness and addiction, you know how completely it can occupy your attention. You know how easy it is for everything else to become peripheral, for weeks to pass in a blur of crisis management and fear and hope and despair. Aizlewood's account of that period, of a household defined by his wife's illness, had the texture of something real. Penelope Aizlewood took her own life in 2017, the year before the trial concluded. She never saw the verdict. Aizlewood was widowed before the jury returned. That fact sat in the courtroom with a particular weight. His defense team leaned into it. The grief was genuine. The loss was genuine, and the implication was clear. How could a man consumed by this level of personal devastation have been simultaneously orchestrating £1 million fraud? The jury's answer was careful and unambiguous. They rejected the defense entirely. The reasoning behind the jury's conclusion is worth understanding because it goes to the heart of what made Aizlewood's role in the fraud so specific and so damning. It wasn't just that he was a director of the company, and directors are expected to know what their companies do. It was that his particular contribution to LMT, the thing that made him genuinely irreplaceable to the operation, was his identity. His reputation as a former professional footballer and Welsh international was the mechanism through which the fraud gained access to the institutions it needed to exploit. Colleges that might have scrutinized a cold approach from an unknown training provider were far more willing to open their doors once when a former international footballer was involved. The skills funding agency's approval processes were navigated more easily when LMT could point to its directors and present the image of a legitimate sporting enterprise. Football clubs that allowed LMT access to their facilities and their networks did so because the name on the letterhead meant something in the game. The prosecution argued that Aizlewood didn't need to be in the room when the ghost learner forms were being filled out. His job was to be there when it counted, in the meetings, in the presentations, in the moments when a skeptical administrator needed reassurance that this was a real operation run by real people with real credentials. His gravitas, as the prosecution described it, was the product being sold. And he provided it consistently over a period of 2 years, while millions of pounds flowed out of public accounts and into private ones. In February 2018, Aizlewood was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud by false representation. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. His co-defendants received sentences of their own. The case closed, the courtroom emptied, and the man who had once worn the Welsh shirt 39 times was going to prison for fraud. There's a specific kind of reckoning that comes when a public figure falls this completely. It's not just the crime itself, it's the distance between who they were and what they did. Mark Aizlewood spent 20 years building a reputation in professional football. He did it the hard way, grinding through club after club, earning cap after cap for Wales, building credibility through years of honest work on a football pitch. That reputation was real. The respect it earned was real. And when he walked into rooms on behalf of LMT, the trust people extended to him was based on something genuine, on a career that had actually happened, on a name that had actually meant something. The fraud didn't just steal public money. It stole that reputation from the young people who might otherwise have benefited from a program run by someone with his experience and standing. It stole it from the colleges and clubs who extended trust in good faith. And in some sense, it stole it from Aizlewood himself, from the version of him that could have spent his post-football years doing something legitimate with the name he'd built. The ghost learners, whose names appeared on those forms, were largely anonymous in the coverage of the case. They weren't called to testify in the way that victims of violent crime are. The harm done to them was bureaucratic and invisible. Names on forms, identities used without consent, the quiet indignity of being enrolled in an educational program that never existed. But they were real people, and what was done to them was a real violation, even if it didn't leave visible marks. Aizlewood served his sentence and was released. What followed his release is, in its own way, the most telling part of the story. He didn't re-emerge into public life in any meaningful way. There were no interviews, no public statements, no attempts to rebuild a profile or offer an explanation. The man who had once been a recognizable face in Welsh football, who had coached, managed and mentored players at various levels of the game, effectively disappeared from public view. That disappearance is worth sitting with. Former footballers who face legal difficulties and serve time don't always vanish. Some return to the media. Some work in lower levels of the game where their past is less scrutinized. Some write books, or do podcasts, or find ways to reframe their story for an audience willing to extend forgiveness. Aizlewood did none of that. He went quiet, and he stayed quiet. It's impossible to know exactly why. It might be shame. It might be the particular difficulty of rebuilding after a fraud conviction, which carries a different stigma than other kinds of criminal records. A stigma rooted not in a moment of violence or desperation, but in calculated deception over a sustained period. It might be grief. Penelope was gone. The life they'd had together was gone. The career and the reputation were gone. What exactly would he have been returning to? Or it might simply be that there was nothing to say. The jury had spoken. The sentence had been served. The ghost learners still hadn't received their qualifications. The £5 million was largely unrecoverable. And the name Mark Aizlewood, which had once opened doors in English and Welsh football, now opened a very different kind of conversation. Mark Aizlewood's story is, at its core, a story about what a name is worth. He spent 2 decades earning his. He earned it honestly, on pitches across England and Wales, in international football, in the kind of grind that builds real professional credibility. And then, over 2 years between 2009 and 2011, he allowed that name to be the engine of a fraud that stole £5 million from public funds and used ordinary people as props in a paper fiction. The grief he carried for Penelope, For the years of watching her struggle, for the loss that came in 2017 was real. Nobody disputes that. Living alongside serious mental illness and addiction is genuinely harrowing, and the toll it takes on the people closest to it is severe and lasting. But the jury's conclusion was that grief, however genuine, doesn't explain away 2 years of active participation in a large-scale financial fraud. The two things existed at the same time. Both were true. One didn't cancel the other out. What's left is this: a career that deserved better, a fraud that deserved its sentence, a wife who deserved more than to be used as a courtroom defense, and a group of young people whose names were enrolled in classes they never attended and whose trust in the football world was taken from them without their knowledge. The damage to trust ran deeper than any single institution. Colleges that opened their doors to LMT because a former Welsh international was involved became more guarded. Football clubs that had allowed access to their facilities and their networks because the name meant something in the game quietly closed those doors. Development programs built on the connection between professional football and vocational education became harder to pitch, harder to fund, and harder to sell to the administrators who'd been burned once already. The fraud didn't just steal money, it poisoned a well that legitimate coaches and educators were still trying to drink from years later. Every honest football development program that struggled to secure college funding after 2011 was, in some small way, paying a tax on what LMT had done. The medals, the caps, the clubs, all of it stands. The career happened. It was real, but it will now always be read through the lens of what came after. That's the sentence that doesn't come with a release date. That's the story of Mark Aizlewood. And the distance between the player he was and the man he became is one of the more uncomfortable journeys in modern British football. Send some prayers for those affected in the comments below, and if this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this one.